Princess Stéphanie of Belgium seemed destined for greatness, but behind the glittering facade of royal life, her world was collapsing. Trapped in a toxic and loveless marriage to the heir of an empire, she endured betrayal, humiliation, and a devastating illness that left her infertile at just 22. Then only 2 years later, a shocking tragedy changed her life forever. Princess Stéphanie was born on 21st May 1864 at the Palace of Laeken, located on the outskirts of Brussels, Belgium. Her father was Prince Leopold, heir to the Belgian throne, and the son of King Leopold I, the first monarch of Belgium following the country's independence in 1831, just a year and a half after Stéphanie's birth. Her grandfather passed away, and her father ascended the throne as King Leopold II of Belgium. To the world, Leopold II appeared to be a powerful and ambitious statesman, determined to place Belgium on the global stage despite its relatively small size. He commissioned grand architectural projects throughout the country, filling Brussels with magnificent palaces, monuments, and civic buildings. These projects helped cultivate his reputation as a visionary ruler who transformed Belgium into a modern European capital. Yet behind the glittering facade of his reign lay a far darker reality. Today, Leopold II's legacy is one of horror. He turned the Congo Free State into his private domain, ruling it with an iron fist and exploiting its people for profit. Under his reign, millions of Congolese were forced into labor on rubber plantations, where they endured terrible atrocities. Tragically, these brutal conditions, combined with disease and famine, led to a sharp decline in the Congolese population. Much of Stéphanie's family wealth had been built, at least in part, on the suffering of the Congolese people. Stéphanie's mother was Marie Henriette of Austria, a member of the powerful House of Habsburg, the royal dynasty that had ruled much of Europe for centuries. Austria itself had governed the region that would later become Belgium for much of the 18th century. Marie Henriette and Leopold had 4 children. Their first daughter, Princess Louise, was born in 1858, followed a year later by their only son, Prince Leopold, in 1859. Nearly 5 years later came Princess Stéphanie, and 8 years after her birth the couple welcomed their youngest child, Princess Clémentine. Yet despite having 4 children, the domestic life of the Belgian royal family was far from harmonious. The marriage between Leopold and Marie had been arranged largely for political reasons, and the two possessed vastly different personalities and interests. Over time, the distance between them grew. By the 1870s, their relationship had deteriorated so badly that the Queen spent long periods living apart from her husband. Within this strained and emotionally distant environment, the royal children were raised under the rigid expectations and formal discipline of court life. For Stéphanie, these early years would soon be overshadowed by a series of devastating tragedies. In January 1869, disaster struck the royal household. Stéphanie's brother, Prince Leopold, the heir to the Belgian throne, suddenly died at the age of 9 after falling ill. His death plunged the monarchy into deep mourning and dealt a severe blow to the already fragile royal family. Although Stéphanie was only 4.5 years old at the time, the loss left a lasting impression on her childhood and further accelerated the collapse of her parents' marriage. Then in 1871, disaster struck again. Across Europe, deadly diseases continued to spread through crowded cities. Epidemics of typhus, smallpox, and cholera, sometimes grimly referred to as the Blue Death, claimed thousands of lives. It was only a matter of time before illness reached the royal palace. Not yet 7 years old, Stéphanie fell gravely ill with typhus. For weeks she hovered between life and death, drifting in and out of consciousness as fever raged through her body. Doctors feared the worst, and her family braced themselves for another tragedy. Yet against all expectations, the young princess survived. 3 years later, Stéphanie's rigorous education began. She was taught a wide range of subjects including history, languages, literature, and court etiquette. Stéphanie grew up multilingual, able to speak several European languages fluently, yet her education was far from gentle. She and her sisters were raised by strict tutors and governesses who believed discipline was essential for royal children. From 1875 onward, Stéphanie often found herself as the highest-ranking female royal regularly present at the Belgian court. Her older sister Louise had married and left Brussels, while their mother, Queen Marie, spent long periods away from the capital. As a result, the young princess was often required to take on ceremonial roles, at an age when most girls were still enjoying childhood. Then, in the winter of 1878, her future was quietly decided. Barely a teenager, Stéphanie was introduced to Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and heir to the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. Rudolf was 20 years old, while Stephanie was only 14. Their meeting was no coincidence. Behind the scenes, negotiations were already underway. The Austrian court saw Stephanie as a suitable bride for the crown prince, someone who could strengthen dynastic alliances and, most importantly, produce male heirs to secure the imperial succession. The pressure surrounding the arrangement was immense. After lengthy diplomatic discussions between the two royal courts, the marriage was formally agreed upon. On May 10th, 1881, just days before her 17th birthday, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium married Crown Prince Rudolf in a magnificent ceremony in Vienna. The wedding was a dazzling spectacle of imperial power, attended by royalty and nobility from across Europe. Yet behind the glittering display, dark clouds were already gathering over their union. Married life proved far from the fairy tale many had imagined. There was no great romance between the couple, only the heavy weight of duty. At first, their relationship appeared cordial, even somewhat happy, but the illusion soon faded. Rudolf possessed a volatile and troubled personality, while Stephanie found herself confined within the rigid confines of the imperial court. Her movements were closely monitored, and her freedom was extremely limited. Despite the growing strain, the marriage did produce a child. In September 1883, Stephanie gave birth to a daughter, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, but instead of celebration, the birth was met with thinly veiled disappointment by Rudolf. What he had wanted, and what the Empire expected, was a male heir. Elizabeth Marie would remain their only child, and Stephanie's only offspring. By the mid-1880s, the young crown princess had become permanently unable to have more children. The cause, tragically, appears to have been her own husband. Rudolf was not only deeply troubled, but also reckless in his personal life. He drank heavily and maintained numerous affairs with women throughout Vienna. During these encounters, most historians believe he eventually passed both syphilis and gonorrhea to Stephanie. The infections caused severe complications that left her infertile at the age of just 22. At first, court doctors attempted to conceal the truth, attributing her condition to peritonitis, but the reality was far darker. Rudolf had kept his illness a secret, and by the time Stephanie discovered the truth, it was already too late. Betrayed and deeply humiliated, she was consumed by resentment. Refusing to share a bed with her husband, she withdrew from him entirely. Night after night, Rudolf staggered home in the early hours of the morning, reeking of alcohol and the perfume of other women. Meanwhile, the crown prince, trapped in his own despair, sank further into a life of excess and debauchery. By the late 1880s, it had become widely known within the imperial court that Stephanie would never bear another child. Rudolf's affairs continued openly, as though nothing had changed. Yet the worst was still to come. Among the many women who passed through Rudolf's life, one would become particularly significant: Baroness Mary Vetsera. In 1888, when she was just 17 years old, Mary became romantically involved with the 30-year-old crown prince. During this period, Rudolf's behaviour grew increasingly erratic, possibly the result of his deteriorating mental and physical health, worsened by untreated syphilis. Together, Rudolf and Mary began spending long periods at Mayerling, a secluded hunting lodge in the woods near Vienna. Rudolf had purchased the estate and transformed it into a private retreat, far from the rigid scrutiny of the imperial court. Then, on the morning of the 30th of January 1889, shocking news reached Stephanie. Her husband, Crown Prince Rudolf, and Mary Vetsera had been found dead at Mayerling. The tragedy became known as the Mayerling Incident. In the days and months that followed, rumours spread across Europe. Whispers of assassination, political conspiracies, and secret plots. For years, speculation surrounded what had truly happened behind the closed doors of the hunting lodge, but the grim truth eventually emerged. Rudolf had shot his young mistress before turning the gun on himself. At just 24 years old, Stephanie was left a widow, still young, yet already unable to have any more children. Curiously, in the farewell letter Rudolf left for her, he expressed a measure of affection. Yet despite those final words, there is little doubt that his presence had cast a long and painful shadow over her life. After Rudolf's death, Stephanie hoped to return home to Belgium, seeking comfort among her own family. But there was one obstacle she could not overcome. Her daughter Elizabeth Marie was still a Habsburg princess, and the imperial court refused to let her leave Vienna. Stephanie, now the dowager crown princess, found herself trapped in a city where she felt increasingly unwelcome. Her imperial in-laws turned their backs on her, viewing her presence as a painful reminder of the scandal and tragedy surrounding Rudolf's death. During this lonely period, she found comfort in a new romance with Count Artur Potocki, a Polish nobleman who had supported her during the darkest days following the Mayerling tragedy. But fate would strike yet again. Potocki, still not 40 years old, developed laryngeal cancer. A failed surgical operation left him unable to speak, and by March 1890 he had died. Once more, Stéphanie was plunged into mourning. Still grieving the violent death of her husband, she now faced the loss of the man who had offered her a brief glimpse of happiness. Seeking escape from her sorrow, Stéphanie began to travel extensively. She wandered across the Mediterranean, visiting Malta, Tunisia, Sicily, and other distant places, searching for distraction, relief, or perhaps the possibility of a new beginning. Still young and free to remarry, King Leopold had ambitious plans for his daughter's future. He hoped that Stéphanie would marry the new heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Such a union would have restored her position within the imperial hierarchy and strengthened the political ties between Belgium and Austria-Hungary, but the match never materialized. Instead, by the late 1890s, Stéphanie found love with Count Elemer Lonier, a Hungarian aristocrat. This was not a carefully negotiated political alliance, but a genuine marriage of affection. In an effort to gain King Leopold's approval, Elemer even converted to Roman Catholicism. It made no difference. In a fierce letter, the king refused to sanction the marriage. He would not permit his daughter to marry beneath what he considered her royal station. Despite her father's opposition, Stéphanie chose her own path. On March 22, 1900, she married Count Elemer at Miramar Castle, near Trieste. By doing so, she lost her imperial status within the Habsburg dynasty. During these years, tensions within the Belgian royal family continued to deepen. Back in Belgium, King Leopold was growing old, with no surviving legitimate son. Arrangements were made for his nephew, Prince Albert, to succeed him as King Albert I. Leopold had long been furious with his daughters for what he saw as marriages beneath their rank, and he had largely cut them out of his life. His resentment ran so deep that he even forbade Stéphanie from attending her mother's funeral in 1902 and refused to see her again before his death. When Leopold II died in 1909, Stéphanie and her sisters expected to inherit a share of his immense fortune. Instead, they discovered something shocking. Much of the king's wealth had been transferred to Caroline Lacroix, his much younger mistress, whom he had secretly married just 5 days before his death. Outraged, Stéphanie and her sisters launched a bitter legal battle over the estate. The dispute dragged on for 5 years, attracting widespread public attention. In the end, Stéphanie secured a settlement of 5 million francs. Then in the summer of 1914, Europe was shaken by an event that would change the course of history. While visiting Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the very man whom Leopold II had once hoped Stéphanie would marry, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. His death triggered a diplomatic crisis that rapidly spiraled into the First World War. Within weeks, Germany invaded Belgium despite the country's neutrality. Stéphanie's homeland was occupied by German forces for the next 4 years. Austria-Hungary, however, was allied with Germany. This placed Stéphanie in an uncomfortable and deeply personal dilemma. She was living within the empire that was helping to occupy her own country. Adding to her unease, Stéphanie had become convinced that Emperor Franz Joseph had in some way been involved in the circumstances surrounding the assassination of his heir, Franz Ferdinand. Fortunately, by that time, she and Elemer were living far from the imperial court. In 1906, they had settled at Rusov's mansion in what is now Slovakia, one of the few areas of the empire largely untouched by the devastation of the war. There, Stéphanie devoted herself to charitable work, trying to find purpose amid the chaos that was engulfing Europe. When Emperor Franz Joseph died in 1916, Stéphanie and Elemer returned to Vienna to attend his funeral, and the coronation ceremonies for the new emperor. Just 2 months later, Elemer was elevated to the rank of prince within the Hungarian aristocracy, yet their world was soon shaken again. In October 1918, Austria-Hungary lost the war, and the once vast empire collapsed into a collection of newly independent nations. Many members of the Habsburg family were forced into exile, but Stéphanie and Elemer were spared. Stéphanie and Prince Elemer remained at Rusov's mansion, though they continued to travel frequently throughout Europe. Their marriage proved to be a genuinely happy one, offering Stéphanie a stability and companionship she had never known during her first marriage. After the First World War, the couple settled into a relatively quiet life. By this time, Stephanie had also become a grandmother, as her daughter Elizabeth Marie had given birth to several children during the early 1900s. Yet despite this new stage of life, tensions soon arose between mother and daughter. In the early 1920s, their relationship became increasingly strained, largely because of Elizabeth Marie's personal choices and political beliefs. Unlike her mother, she embraced socialist politics and openly rejected many of the traditions of the old imperial world. Because of her outspoken views and radical lifestyle, she became widely known in Austria as the Red Archduchess. The conflict between mother and daughter eventually reached a breaking point. After a final falling out in 1924, Stephanie and Elizabeth Marie severed contact completely and never spoke to each other again. During these later years, Stephanie turned her attention to writing her memoirs. They were published in 1935 and later released in English in 1937 under the title I Was to Be Empress. However, the book was not a complete autobiography. Stephanie devoted little attention to the more than 50 years that had passed since the death of Crown Prince Rudolf. Instead, the memoir was divided into 4 parts, with the final section titled The Tragedy of Mailing. In many ways, the narrative of her life, at least the version she chose to share, seemed to end in 1889. Perhaps her publishers understood that this was the story readers most wanted to hear, or perhaps Stephanie herself preferred not to revisit the deeply private chapters of her life that followed that fateful day. Then, in September 1939, the Second World War broke out. Although Stephanie and her husband did not live near the front lines, the surrounding region was eventually drawn into the widening conflict. Toward the end of the war, the couple became deeply concerned when Nazi authorities planned to convert Rusovsk Mansion into a military field hospital as the Soviet Red Army advanced into Central Europe. When Soviet forces approached in the spring of 1945, Stephanie and Elimir sought refuge at the Pannonhalma Archer Abbey in Hungary. It was there that Stephanie spent the final months of her life. On August 23, 1945, she died at the age of 81. A year earlier, she had formally disinherited her daughter, and Elizabeth Marie did not attend her mother's funeral. Stephanie was buried in the crypt of Pannonhalma Arch Abbey. Less than a year later, Prince Elimir also passed away and was laid to rest beside her.